A dressing room at Paramount Pictures, 1956. The air smells like hairspray and powder. She sits at the vanity while someone pins her hair into place. The dress is already on, a pale blue silk that cost more than her father made in a year. The jewelry sits in a velvet box on the table, and beside it, folded with care, a pair of white gloves. She reaches for them without being told. Nobody has to remind her. The premiere starts in 40 minutes, and the gloves go on before she leaves this room, before she steps into the hallway, before anyone with a camera can see her hands. In every photograph from 1950s Hollywood, you see them. White gloves at afternoon luncheons, champagne-colored gloves at evening premieres, short gloves for cocktails, long gloves for galas. Grace Kelly wore them. Audrey Hepburn wore them. Every actress photographed between 1950 and 1962 wore them in public, not occasionally, but constantly, as if they were as essential as lipstick or shoes. Look at any studio publicity photograph from that era. The gloves are always there, always pristine, always fitted, always part of the silhouette. It looked like elegance. It looked like old Hollywood glamour at its most refined. It wasn't just fashion. It was something else entirely. The studio system had rules that never appeared in writing. They were passed from studio executives to publicity managers, from costume departments to the actresses themselves. Some rules were obvious. Always camera ready. Never gain weight. Never appear in public looking less than perfect. Other rules were quieter, embedded so deeply into the culture that no one thought to name them. The glove rule was one of those. By 1955, every major studio in Hollywood had an unspoken dress code for their contract actresses. It covered everything from hemlines to hairstyles, from the color of nail polish to the acceptable height of a heel. And buried inside that code, invisible but absolute, was this. When you leave the studio lot, when you appear at a restaurant, a premiere, a charity luncheon, a department store opening, you wear gloves. Nobody explained why. You simply did. Here's what the gloves were doing that nobody said out loud. A woman in gloves cannot snack. She cannot reach into a breadbasket at a restaurant table without making it an event. She cannot casually pick at appetizers during a cocktail party. She cannot eat a canapé without deliberate effort. The gloves created a barrier, a physical distance between her hands and food, and that distance was not accidental. Hollywood actresses in the 1950s lived under constant photographic surveillance. Every lunch was a publicity opportunity. Every dinner was a photo op. Photographers stationed themselves outside Chasen's, Romanoff's, the Brown Derby, waiting for starlets to arrive. The women inside those restaurants knew this. They knew that every gesture was being watched, that every photograph could end up in a magazine, that the public was paying attention to what they ate, how they ate, whether they looked hungry. The gloves solved a problem the studios never acknowledged existed. If you cannot easily eat, you eat less. If eating requires removing your gloves, smoothing them carefully beside your plate, making a small ceremony of it, you think twice before reaching for the bread. The gloves were not just accessories. They were appetite control disguised as elegance. This was not something the studio publicity department advertised. It was never written into a contract clause. But it was taught, quietly, in the costume fittings, in the deportment lessons every contract actress received, in the careful instructions given before a premiere or a press luncheon. Don't forget your gloves. It sounded like a reminder about fashion. It was a reminder about discipline. Stay with this part, because what happened at the table tells you everything about what the gloves really meant. At the Polo Lounge in 1957, a young actress sits at a table with a columnist from Photoplay. Lunch has been arranged by the studio. The actress orders a Cobb salad. The photographer arrives halfway through the meal. She sets down her fork, picks up her gloves from beside her plate, and slides them back on. The photograph that appears in the magazine 2 weeks later shows a poised young woman, gloves on, smiling at the camera, the salad untouched in front of her. The caption reads, "Always elegant, never hurried." The ritual of removing gloves and replacing them became its own performance. A woman entering a restaurant would keep her gloves on until seated. She would remove them slowly, one finger at a time, folding them precisely beside her plate. This took time. It created a pause. And in that pause, she was making a choice about whether eating was worth the ceremony of undressing her hands in public. Most of the time, it wasn't. The gloves did something else. They enforced posture. A woman in gloves cannot slouch without the gloves creasing awkwardly at the wrists. She cannot rest her elbows on the table without the fabric pulling. She cannot fidget, pick at her nails, or nervously adjust her hair without calling attention to the movement. The gloves turned her body into something that required maintenance, constant awareness, a performance that began the moment she put them on. Hollywood actresses were not just wearing gloves. They were wearing a reminder that they were always being watched, always on display, always performing a version of femininity that required control at every level. The gloves were the uniform of that performance. There were rules within the rules. Short gloves, ending at the wrist, were for afternoon events, luncheons, shopping, daytime publicity appearances. Long gloves, reaching past the elbow, were reserved for evening premieres, formal dinners, award ceremonies. White or cream for spring and summer. Darker tones, champagne, taupe, pale gray for fall and winter. The gloves had to match the occasion precisely. Wearing evening gloves to a luncheon would have been as inappropriate as arriving in a nightgown. Edith Head, the costume designer who dressed more Hollywood actresses than anyone in that era, understood what the gloves represented. In photographs of her fittings, the gloves are always present, laid out on the table alongside the dress, the shoes, the jewelry. They were not an afterthought. They were part of the architecture of the look, as essential as the seams in the dress or the height of the heel. In her notes, never published but archived at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, she wrote about the importance of finishing the silhouette. The gloves, she noted, completed the line from shoulder to fingertip. But they also did something more practical. They kept hands still. They kept gestures deliberate. They kept an actress from touching her face, adjusting her hair, or engaging in any small nervous movement that would read as unpolished on camera. The gloves were control, externalized. By the late 1950s, this had become so embedded in Hollywood culture that no one questioned it. A young actress arriving in Los Angeles for the first time, signed to a 7-year contract with MGM or Warner Brothers, would be taken to wardrobe within days. She would be fitted for dresses, shoes, undergarments, and gloves. Always gloves. Multiple pairs. White kid leather for daytime, satin for evening, champagne or pale pink for spring premieres. She would be told gently but clearly that these were not optional. The cost was not insignificant. A single pair of fitted kid leather gloves in 1956 cost between $8 and $12, close to a day's wages for the average American worker. An actress under contract might own 20 or 30 pairs. They had to be cleaned professionally. They had to be stored carefully, laid flat in tissue paper to prevent creasing. They had to be replaced the moment they showed wear. A stain, a loose seam, a pulled thread, any imperfection was unacceptable. The studios paid for the gloves of their top stars. For younger contract players, the cost came out of their salaries. It was understood, part of the job, part of the price of being seen. But here is what makes this worth paying attention to. The gloves were doing something the actresses themselves might not have fully understood. Audrey Hepburn's wardrobe for Sabrina in 1954 included 14 pairs of gloves designed specifically for the film. Off-screen, her personal collection was equally extensive. Photographs taken of her in Rome, in Paris, in New York between 1955 and 1965 show her wearing gloves in almost every image. Not because she was cold, not because she was making a fashion statement. Because that was what a woman of her stature did. She wore gloves. She controlled her presentation. She never let the world see her hands unfinished. Grace Kelly, before she became Princess of Monaco, was photographed in gloves at virtually every public appearance between 1952 and 1956. Even casual photographs taken on studio lots show her in gloves more often than not. The gloves were part of her image, inseparable from the carefully constructed persona of untouchable elegance that made her a star. The system worked because it was invisible. A woman watching these actresses in magazines and newsreels at premieres saw elegance. She saw glamour. She saw women who seemed effortlessly composed, always ready, always perfect. She did not see the mechanism underneath. She did not see the studio requirements, the constant surveillance, the unspoken rules about food, posture, movement. She saw the gloves and thought refinement. What she did not think was control. There was one moment when the system revealed itself and almost no one noticed. In 1959, a young actress, newly signed to 20th Century Fox, attended her first industry luncheon without gloves. She had forgotten them. It was an honest mistake. She sat at the table with the other actresses, her bare hands visible, and within minutes she realized something was wrong. The women around her were looking at her hands, not her face. Her hands. One of the older actresses leaned close and whispered something. The young actress excused herself, left the restaurant, and did not return. The story circulated quietly in the wardrobe departments. It was told as a cautionary tale. The lesson was clear. The gloves were not optional. Forgetting them was not a mistake you made twice. What no one said explicitly was why it mattered so much, but the women understood. Bare hands at the table meant access to food. Bare hands meant the possibility of eating without ceremony, without the deliberate performance of removing gloves, without the pause that made you reconsider. Bare hands meant you might forget you were being watched. In 1963, something shifted. The studio system was dissolving. 7-year contracts were ending. Actresses were becoming independent. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, the gloves started to disappear. By 1965, you could attend a Hollywood premiere and see actresses arriving without them. By 1968, gloves at daytime events had become rare. By 1970, they had vanished almost completely from public life, relegated to formal weddings and state dinners, no longer a daily requirement, no longer part of the uniform. What replaced them? Nothing. And that absence is the point. The modern red carpet photographs every starlet without gloves, without the physical reminder to control her gestures, without the barrier between her hands and food, without the enforced elegance that came from knowing her hands were always on display. She is free to move however she wants, to eat however she wants, to touch her face or adjust her dress or reach for a glass of champagne without ceremony. But something else came with that freedom. The surveillance did not end. It intensified. In 1956, a photographer might catch an actress at lunch once a week. In 2024, every moment is documented, every angle captured, every gesture analyzed by millions of people within hours. The gloves are gone, but the pressure to appear perfect has not decreased. It has simply moved from external control to internal expectation. The women who wore gloves in 1950s Hollywood were performing under a system that made the rules explicit. You wear this. You move like this. You eat like this. The system was oppressive, but it was at least visible. You knew what was expected. You knew when you were performing and when you were not. The modern actress performs constantly, under invisible rules that shift every season, without gloves to mark the boundary between public and private, without any external signal to tell her when the performance begins and ends. There is a photograph from 1958, a premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theater. A young actress steps out of a black limousine. The flashbulbs go off. She is wearing a pale pink gown, diamonds at her throat, and white satin gloves that reach past her elbows. Her hands are folded carefully in front of her. Her posture is perfect. She is smiling, but the smile does not reach her eyes. The gloves are spotless. They will stay on for the next 4 hours. She will not eat at the reception. She will not touch her face. She will not let her hands do anything that has not been carefully rehearsed. Someone watching that photograph today might see elegance. They might see old Hollywood glamour at its peak. They might see a woman who knew how to dress, how to present herself, how to embody a version of femininity that no longer exists. They would not be wrong, but they would not be seeing the whole picture. The gloves were beautiful. The gloves were control. The gloves were a solution to a problem that Hollywood created and then sold back to the women it employed. And when the gloves finally disappeared, the problem did not go with them. It just became harder to see. Subscribe. The next one goes deeper.